Yes, yes. Okay, welcome. We're going to be presenting some pictures and information from our experiences as Peace Corps volunteers from 1971 to 73, a long time ago. But don't despair. Ralph will then present information about what happened from the time we left Afghanistan in May of 1973 until the present. When we left, the country was reasonably stable and peaceful under the king. Our presentation will last a little over an hour. We're then going to welcome questions after the presentation, but we'll also be out in the vestibule to answer any questions about what you see out there. But first, I'm going to give you a lesson that we learned our very first day of training in Afghanistan, heat about 105, sitting on a concrete floor. What to call the people from Afghanistan. They are called Afghans, but we use Afghans, or singularly, he or she is an Afghan. This is important, very important, as a currency used in Afghanistan is called Afghanis. So when you say Afghanis, it would be like calling an American a dollar. So the people are Afghans or an Afghan. It took me 2 telephone calls to get Channel 27 to clean up their act with their news broadcasters, but I did. Okay, we hope this will be an enjoyable experience for you. The goal is a combination of entertainment, information, and education about our beloved Afghanistan. Let us take you back to the early 70s. The U.S. was in turmoil over ever-escalating Vietnam War protests. It was almost 10 years since President Kennedy founded the Peace Corps. Ralph and I had finished our educations. We had spent 3 years with Ralph serving in the Air Force. He had a good job, and I was a stay-at-home mom. We had built our first home and had 3 children, ages 8, 10, and 12. I responded to an ad on TV for Peace Corps volunteers, perhaps out of curiosity or restlessness, by having achieved all of our goals of a job, home, and children. More likely, as I look back, it was a guiding principle that Ralph and I had talked over and settled on very early in our marriage. We are blessed to be a blessing. We received a packet from Peace Corps with a section on a new family program designed to attract mid-career professionals as opposed to recent young college grads. After much, much soul searching, we applied, thinking perhaps Ralph would match an architectural program in Tunisia. We received an invitation for a program in Afghanistan, with Ralph teaching architecture and I teaching English as a foreign language at Kabul University. We pored over maps of Afghanistan, or of Africa, looking for Afghanistan. We had no idea. We never knew where it was. We finally found it in Asia between Pakistan and Iran. We then attended a very long weekend in Chicago for interviews. They gave us information. We accepted, and thus began an adventure beyond our wildest imaginations, and were forever enriched all 5 of our lives. Yes, 5 of us went. Our 3 children, Mark on the right, Laura in the middle, and she's here tonight, and Dave, our youngest, in front of me. One of us had been on an airplane, that was Ralph, and I was the only one who hadn't. So we dressed for the occasion in those days.
I think now we all know where Afghanistan is and can find it on a map. What many of us didn't realize is the topography. And so down the central spine of the country, in the long direction, is an extension of the Himalayas, very, very rugged mountains called the Hindu Kush, Hindu killers. And to the south of that are deserts. And north of those mountains, as an extension of the grasslands that come from Central Asia, are the steppes. There's another line of mountains, less spectacular, along the eastern edge, separating Afghanistan from Pakistan. And when we arrived in 1971, Afghanistan had a population of about 16 million people. There were, and still are, 2 dominant tribal, ethnic, language groups. The largest group, the Pashtuns, are concentrated in the south and east, bordering and overlapping into Pakistan. They generally speak Pashto. The Tajiks, who speak Dari, which is a dialect of Persian Farsi, are primarily in the west and the north. Both of these groups practice the Sunni branch of Islam. These tribal, ethnic backgrounds of the Afghans are key to understanding. There's a third ethnic group, a minority group called the Hazaras. They live in the central highlands in a very rugged area called the Hazara Jat, and they practice Muslim Shia religion. One thing we need to know, because it's very key to understanding Afghanistan and the Afghans themselves, their allegiance is primarily to family. Secondly, to their tribal or ethnic group, and very distantly to any sort of central government which might hold power at that particular time.
This is the initial view when they said, "You are now approaching Kabul," that we took out of the airplane window. It was not very comforting. We boarded a plane in Philadelphia. We flew to Amsterdam. We had about a 3-4 hour layover in Amsterdam. And then we flew to Frankfurt, Germany. We had a layover there. Then, very short. Then we flew from Germany to Beirut, Lebanon, and then to Tehran, Iran, and finally landed in Kabul 32 hours later. We had traveled halfway around the world. That's yours.
This is our new home, Kabul, as it looked in 1971. Kind of in a bowl at the foothills of the Hindu Kush, a low-rise city. That's the Kabul River in the foreground, which most of the time was dry. But a city of 500,000 people with no central sewer system. Think about that for a minute.
Our kids were excellent ambassadors. Once again, Mark's in the middle, Dave's on the right, and Laura's there. And Tadul, one of Dave's friends, unfortunately his head missed out in the slide. And then our dog, Sammy. Sammy was given to us by one of our Afghan instructors, Fez. Fez was married to an American woman whom he met when he was at Ball State University getting his education, and they were expecting their first child. So they had Sammy, who was the daughter of the British ambassador's dog, and they got her as a puppy. And so, of course, they asked us if we wanted it, and anybody that wanted her, if anybody knows us, we know we took her. And we then shipped her back after we left Afghanistan, and she was with us for many, many years. Here I am, coming back probably from the Bird Bazaar, which we'll hear later. I'm in front of a house that we rented. It was very nice with 3 bedrooms, and all the houses in the neighborhood had walls around them, so that was very nice. But once we finished our training, we had to go out and rent our own home and furnish it. Our training house they provided for us, but then we had to go out on our own. We had a minimum of language skills because they needed us at the university. So instead of how long?
Instead of 3 months, which it was supposed to be,
We had
6 weeks of training.
Yeah, okay, so we had a minimum of language skills. As we walked around the neighborhoods looking for a place to rent, we saw signs, all capital letters, black on white, saying TOLET. And we wondered, why would someone advertise a toilet by their door? And then we realized it was to let, with no space between the words. So we started knocking on doors. And a gentleman would answer, and Ralph would say, Honam Heradi, which we thought said, is your house for rent? Now the word for house is Hona, and he should have been saying Hona Heradi. Instead, the word for wife is Honam, and so it's saying, is your wife for rent? We had a lot of doors slammed in our faces.
But we were ultimately successful, did rent the house, but that wasn't the end of it. In spite of our lack of language, we had to furnish that house. And so we had to go into the bazaars and bargain. And here Dave and I are in the tin bazaar, and we're buying audans. And I'll talk about audans later. They were very important to our survival. But we also had to buy beds and desks and table and chairs and all of the other things that go into keeping house, and do all of that in Farsi.
Okay, this is a Karachi, and in front of those two poles is a gentleman who is pulling it. And on it is some furniture that we bought, some desks and I don't know what else. And Dave is on the back and Mark is under the desk, and they are directing the Karachi puller where to take the furniture, because there are no street signs, maybe not now either, but no street signs in Kabul, and our language wasn't good enough to explain to the driver where to go. So you can see how safe we felt there, that we put these two little boys in the Karachi and told them where to go. Here is Dave in the bird bazaar. I had mentioned on my bike I had some birds. Laura particularly was very interested in pigeons, and there were a bunch of little mud huts out in the back of our property. And so they took over one of them as a pigeon coop. And Dave is walking in there, and actually his language, I think, was the best of all of ours. And he was bargaining with the shopkeeper for a bird or birds that he was going to buy. This is Mark. He had a harder time adjusting, probably because he was a bit older. You can see how crowded it is, and the sense of personal space is very, very different in Afghanistan. Also, the sights, the sounds, and the smells, the many, many differences, the noise, everything, resulted in my having what was described as the worst case of culture shock they'd ever seen among the volunteers in Afghanistan.
There are those audans that I said we would come back to that we had purchased in the tin bazaar. And this gentleman is about to go to the U.S. Embassy, where there was a deep well with pure water. And he was going to fill those so that we had pure water. The reason for that was that although there was a water system in the city, the pipes that brought that water down from the mountains were old and cracked, and there were all sorts of microorganisms that had found their way into the city water, and we were much better off having pure water. So in this case, you'll notice in the lower part there, he's got something in his hand. It's a piece of paper, and on that piece of paper it says, "This is my trusted servant. Please accord to him all of the courtesies as if I were bringing these audans to be filled myself." Now, he couldn't read, the guards at the embassy couldn't read, but it didn't matter. That's all he needed in order to get through the doors.
This is a picture of a Kram standing in the back and our three kids. And the fellow holding his head up was Mr. Mach's son. He was an unusual character. They were at a park, and it was a Kram's job to take those kids out every day and teach them language, show them around Kabul, give them experiences. Of course, I didn't know a Kram, and I didn't know where he was taking those kids. So the culture shock was not made very much better by that. But then the kids soon started school, and there was a big yellow school bus that would pull up in front of our house. It still is rather embarrassing when I think of it. And they were taken to American International School of Kabul. Actually, the woman who is running it now is a refugee up at Fort McCoy, and so I hope to be meeting her soon. It was an international school, truly, and there were a lot of USAID, United States Aid to Development, and United States Information Service people there. And so the American school was much more American than any school that you would see here in the States.
Here's Marie on a bicycle. She's about to pass this guy on the right, and he's going to be very surprised because having a woman on a bicycle was not a usual experience in Kabul. To the right of that picture are a bunch of melons called harbuzah, the best in the world. We really wish we could find some of those here. The reason we had bicycles is because as volunteers we were not allowed to drive. We had access to the Afghan buses, to the taxis, but we couldn't drive, and there was a reason. Shortly before we had arrived in country, one of the American Peace Corps staff had been in an accident at a corner where an Afghan had run into the staff member's car, causing a bit of damage. It ended up in court, and the Afghan judge, after hearing the case, said, well, please pay the Afghan money. And our staff member said, but why? He ran into me, and the judge said, I know. You have money, he doesn't, pay him. So as volunteers, we didn't drive.
When we were in our training house when we first got there, across the street was a naan shop. And you probably have seen naan, which is nothing like the naan that was baked in Afghanistan. Buried in that little shop is a beehive, smaller at the top, and then it gets bigger at the bottom, clay oven. And every night they would put dogs in there, and they would start them on fire, a lot of smoke in the neighborhood. And then by morning, there were just hot coals there. They would roll the dough into balls, flatten it out, and slap it up against the side of that oven. And just before it would fall down in the coals, they'd grab it. It is the most delicious bread you've ever tasted in your life. Notice on the left, the lady and the mother in the shadri, crouched down there. Her little boy, as you notice, is wearing a American snowsuit, and that was probably one that you gave to Goodwill and they didn't want to use. The naan shop owner was very, very important in my life. It hadn't been Dave was an adventuresome one. It hadn't been very long we'd been there, then I couldn't find Dave. And I opened the door, and I looked up and down the street, and I was getting a bit panicky, still in culture shock. And the naan shop owner said, Mr. Dawood, now Dawood is David in Dari. I said, Bali, yes. He said, Unjas, which means over there. So I went and knocked on this door, and sure enough, David found a friend, and he was over playing at the friend's house. So I could go out at any time of the day and say, Mr. Dawood, he'd say, Unjas. He kept track of him.
So the neighborhood was really pretty safe. This is public water. So this is from those pipes that come down from the mountains, and the young man is filling a container which he will carry up higher in the hills because the water didn't go that high. And so he would earn a few Afs, or Afghanis, and that was how he was making his living.
Okay, the next few slides are going to explain why we had to have a servant. I never dreamed in my entire lifetime I would have a servant. But we had a very small fridge, and all pieces of food had to be bought every day. And this is fresh vegetables, and it's about a block down from our house. Whoops. This is the meat market, and you'd have to, no, I want the one with the meat market. This is the meat market, and it's very interesting. I would have had to get up at the crack of dawn to go over and get a fresh piece of meat, otherwise all the pieces would be gone. These are fat-tailed sheep that are hanging up there, and you can see where their tails were. There's a lot of fat there, and it's during famine, and there's not much for them to eat. They can survive on the fat in their tails. Next. This is a gentleman outside the meat market making hamburger. They cooked it well. This is the head of sheep having been cut off, facing, and the tails of feet of sheep. I said to Ralph, I don't think we ever ate those, did we? And he said, well, we'll never know. There are some American sweaters, clothing hanging up in the back that they were selling, but this was a bazaar street that was just down from our house. This is our servant. He's cutting, we've just been to the meat market, and he's cutting up the meat. That's yours.
Yeah, this is a picture of chaudhries drying. They've just been dyed in the local dye shop and are hanging up to dry. A common sight in the back streets of Kabul. And on the bottom of the picture, a young man has set up a little stand where he is selling apples. And this is the Nixon Bazaar, so called because Nixon was president of the United States at the time. And those clothes that were not used in the United States were baled up and sent over in large bundles to places like Afghanistan, sold in this particular bazaar. And the Afghans liked to have those because they were very inexpensive and usually pretty durable. In the foreground, you see something that is really one of our beds, or like our beds, with saplings for the side structure, and then woven mesh for what supported the mattress. The mattress was a bag filled with cotton.
This is Laura, our daughter, sitting in the front row in front of a carpet shop. Along the bazaar streets, there are all little cubby holes, and each sold something different. This is someone selling carpets. Over on the right, you can see a little boy doing his homework. And Laura had very long blonde hair at that time, and the curious street kids who had very little manners were determined they were going to touch her long blonde hair, so she had some issues with that. This is an interesting series. Ralph mentioned the mattresses were big, huge pillows filled with cotton. And this was called the Cotton Twanger. As you can see, the cotton is all matted down and really not very comfortable to sleep on. So he has on the top kind of a bow and another string coming down. In his hand, he has a thing that he throws the cotton up against that, and then it is thrown against the screen in this case, and is nice and soft, and he stuffs it back into the pillows, and we have for a few weeks a nice mattress. This picture we took just because I found his face just so amazing, just absolutely so amazing. I think he had many stories to tell, and I couldn't understand them, so we never did find them.
This is an interesting picture. Peace Corps wanted to make sure after we'd finished our training that we had sufficient knowledge of language and culture to be on our own. And so as a final exam, each of the Peace Corps volunteers were sent off into someplace in the country to see if we could survive. We chose to go to Jalalabad, which was very warm in August. That's near the Pakistani border. And one of the things the Peace Corps wanted us to do was to take all sorts of side trips and have experiences which we then documented, and so that was part of what we used to prove that we had actually been there. We heard that there was a little village not too far from Jalalabad called Shewa, and that they did something rather unique, which was to build wooden bowls and then cover the outside of the bowls with a colored wax, usually an orange color, and then they would carve down through that wax layer to the wood underneath to make designs. There's an example out in the lobby that you can look at. And so we heard about these, and we decided, well, we had to see all of this. This was kind of fun. So we managed to hire a driver who had a covered truck and set off for Shewa. But the driver kept stopping along the way. And Afghans would get on, which was okay. We were paying for the trip, but they were going our way, so that was all right. And it kept going until the truck was full. And things were quiet for a while, and then for some reason, I don't know why, we decided we would sing camp songs. So the deacon went down, and all of those sorts of things. And so we sang a couple, and then the Afghans clapped, and they sang some of their songs. And that went on until we got to Shewa, and by that time, we were all good friends, and that's what you see here. This was the crew that had been with us on that bus truck to Shewa, an interesting experience. Another experience, in this case, we were traveling with friends of ours who did have a vehicle. They were part of USAID in the northern part of Afghanistan, and we came across this sight of a gentleman skinning a camel. And we thought that was interesting, so we all stopped and got out of the car. Now, this gentleman has a knife, and we weren't too sure whether we were really welcome there, but we had a secret weapon. And the secret weapon you can see in the guy's hand, right there. And that was the fact that we had a Polaroid camera, and we had just taken his picture, and he saw himself in a photograph for the first time ever. And from there on, we were the best of friends.
Okay. Um, the fellow who gave us the dog also gave us his half-brother. His name is Saeed. And he lived with us off and on for about a year and a half. But his village was in Jalalabad, which was very, very close to where we were taking our provincial trip. So we went to his village, met his fathers. They were actually half-brothers. And so we were shown around by Saeed, who'd been our guest for a year and a half. And this, as you see, is a group of animal skins in which each orifice that had been opened during skinning and butchering were now tied up, and they were blown up with air. And then they were lashed together, and they made a raft. And this was a raft that we used to get across the river. The fellow laid, as I remember, it's a long time ago, laid on it, and he would paddle either with his feet or his hands. And I remember all 5 of us getting on the raft, but looking at it, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure all 5. You remember, Laurel? No, she was too.
I think we were ferried across in groups.
Well,
I
we'll
hope
see.
so.
Anyway, you notice we're going downstream, so he wasn't paddling upstream.
So that was a bit of the infrastructure. Here's another piece. This village happened to be on 2 sides of a fairly large river, and so they strung a pedestrian a hanging bridge across. A little bit more stable was this bridge, which again had been made out of local materials and was quite sturdy. In fact, it was sturdy enough to hold vehicles like this. This is a painted truck. Afghan artists would look in magazines and find pictures, which they would copy, really with a lot of technical ability. And we never saw any sort of human figures pictured, but it was fun to see these going through Kabul and on the roads.
This is a little thing on transportation. Here's a fellow. This was taken in Herat, which is just across the border from Iran. And I don't know exactly where he's going or what he's doing, but he's riding on his camel and or a donkey and taking his camel somewhere. But you notice he's got a big grin when he sees us. There weren't many foreigners in Herat, believe me. But my one big disappointment, which Ralph put his foot down, was I just fell in love with donkeys. I thought they were the coolest things, and I thought we have a big backyard. We could have a donkey. Well, we never did have a donkey, but I still think it would have been fun. This is a gentleman who has been out in the desert gathering brush and things to start fires with, and that's the way he makes his living. He sells clumps of that to start fires. Now, this is an interesting. Afghans are great recyclers, and this is another Karachi. There's 2 men on the right pulling it. This automobile has a little bit of a problem. We had a discussion whether it would go into scrap or the parts would be used or whether it would be fixed up and put back on the road. I think there's a chance of each of those things happening.
This is the Kabul Gorge. Kabul was at 6,000 feet, about the same elevation as Denver, and Jalalabad at the other end of this road was down in a semi-tropical lower area. The United States had funded and probably had contractors build this particular road. It's going through the Kabul Gorge. On the other end of that in Pakistan is the Kyber Pass. And looking at this, you can get a feeling of what the British soldiers went through when they attacked Afghanistan from what is now Pakistan. This road, which goes through the Hindu Kush and links the northern and the southern parts of Afghanistan, was actually built by the Russians. The structure you see here is an avalanche barrier so that when rocks and snow came down, it didn't block the road. This is the mosque in Mazar-e-Sharif in the northern part of Afghanistan. It's a very important mosque to Islam. There is a rumor that perhaps Ali, the 4th Caliph, who was the cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad, might have been buried here. And as a result, it's a point of people coming to worship. Notice the beautiful tile work and the blue domes with turquoise tile, which was pretty typical of all of the mosques. This is the courtyard of that same mosque, and you can see the tile work in the background. You also see the white pigeons. Another one of the long ago stories was that the reason the pigeons were all white is that this was very holy ground, and if any pigeons who weren't white were to land, they would immediately turn white. We never saw anything but a white pigeon, so maybe the story is correct. This is a city also in the north called Balkh. Balkh was the center of Zoroastrian religion, and so as a city, it goes back a long, long way. This is a Muslim mosque. It's old, but it's not nearly that old.
This is a mosque in western Afghanistan, back near Herat. It's a beautiful mosque, and it's really hard to comprehend that those tiles are each individually made and are about this big. Each one is made by hand. This is an oasis which was settled by Buddhists in about 600 AD. The holes you can see in the stone were entrances to caves where the Buddhist monks lived. This is the sculpture that is carved into the rocks, and it's 175 feet high. And if you can look on the right, kind of in the middle, there's a person standing there, so you get some idea of how high it was. How in the world they did it, I have no idea. Now, we went into those little holes, and there were passageways, stairs, and things, and all 5 of us climbed up to the very top of the carving of the cutout, and we were able to walk out on the Buddhist head and look over Bamiyan Valley. This sculpture is the one that was destroyed by the Taliban in the early 2000s. They used cannons and dynamites to blow it up because they didn't believe that graven images, well, they did believe that graven images were forbidden. Therefore, you never see any pictures or sculptures in a mosque. It was in the process of being rebuilt, but who knows what will happen now.
And this is Bandi Amir, also in the central mountains. Those are lakes that are caused by the accretion of limestone over long, long periods of time. They're quite tall, and there are a series of 5 of these lakes, so that as you come out of the mountains in the very desolate area and you come over the ridge and into this valley, you see this beautiful sight. And again, the scale is amazing. At the very lower part is a person. There are pictures out in the lobby that give you a better feeling for that. This is a shrine. It happens to be in the southern part of Afghanistan. You found them all over, and many were very crude, made out of mud bricks, but most of them had these beautiful domes with these turquoise tile. This is much, much older. In the southwestern part of the country, in the desert, there's a Helmand River, which used to be much more verdant, and there was quite a civilization that grew up along the banks of that river. Some of the structures the archaeologists have found go all the way back to the Persian Empire and even Alexander the Great, who came through this particular part of Afghanistan. And this is Nuristan on the northeast side next to Pakistan. Very remote, very difficult to get to. I was there only because the director of the university was being asked by the director of tourism for the government to send a group up into these hills to see if there were ways in which they could put hotels in to encourage the tourist industry. And that gives you a feeling for where Afghanistan was in 1972. This is some of the housing, and because there were trees in this region, they used timber as well as stone to build their houses.
These are kuchi tents. A fairly large proportion of the population are nomads, and they travel with their animals to find grazing land. And these are the tents that are carried on the back of camels and are set up very, very quickly. This is, Ralph was talking about shrines. This was a mud brick shrine. And as you see in the background, there's flags. People, especially women, come with their worries, their desires, and they have string or cloth, and they tie on those poles. In the front is a graveyard. Now, the soil there is very, very rocky, and we can't dig very deep. So the bodies are not buried very far, and then rocks are piled on top to make a grave. These are some Nomad women. I don't know how many times they'd had their picture taken. They look a little bit uncomfortable. This is a woman and her daughter. We had gotten, I think this was when we had a ride up to Bandi Amir. She came up to where we had gotten out to stretch our legs, and she was saying she was very, very, very ill. She was asking for medicine, and all I had was some aspirin, and as I look back, I hope she didn't have any stomach problems, but she was very, very grateful, and I said, do only 2 at a time, so I hope I was able to help her a little bit.
And this is the national sport. It's played on horseback, as you can see, and there theoretically are 2 teams. The intent of the sport is to take a goat, which has been filled, the carcass has been filled with wet sand to make it heavier, and that goat is placed on the ground. One of the riders goes by, scoops up the goat, and tries to go down to one end of the field and go around a pole that's been set, and then from there back to the center of the field where a circle has been marked in the ground. Now, you would think that his team would be helping him, but in fact, members of his team are also trying to get the goat, just like the opposition, so that they would have the advantage of being able to say that they were the strongest and the bravest and the best of them all. And I think this guy must have just scored a goal because he's obviously very pleased with himself.
This is a tea server. Tea is very, very, very important in Afghanistan. I gave up coffee while I was there because we really couldn't find it. The Afghans like to take a sugar cube and put it between their teeth, and then they drink the tea. I never was quite that good, but we did learn to eat lamb and drink tea while we were in Afghanistan. This is Pagman. It's a park, and parks are very widely used. People get together. Families are very important, and they're extended families. And you see their little girl in the front, but there's only men here. And the women are probably off somewhere having their own group.
And this was pretty typical. As we would go through the streets of Kabul, we would be stared at by folks. In this case, these are Pashtuns, you can tell by the headdress, and they seem quite friendly. And we always felt reasonably safe going through the streets. This is back up in Nuristan, and this is what the folks up there look like. Alexander's people got that far, and because it was fairly remote, there's a feeling that maybe some of the Greek got left there in the DNA, and so that some of these people are related to Alexander. You can see one of his daughters is there, and some of the family's wealth is in the jewelry that she's wearing on her chest. This was his wife. You can see the really dramatic drop-off in the land right behind her. She does not have face covering. She's not wearing shadri, and that was pretty typical in Nuristan. And so her young child is there. He doesn't have any diapers on. What he does have on is a pair of sandals from the Nixon Bazaar. So America was spread even to Nuristan.
This is up in northern Afghanistan, and these are Turkoman women. They do not wear shadri. You can see behind them to the left various ways of wearing shadri that is kind of cheating a little bit, but older women can get away with that stuff. The 2 children who are having their hands held our little boys. And many of the people the tribal people in Afghanistan, they do not rejoice when they have a baby girl, but the little boys are very, very nervous about them growing into adulthood. And so for the first few years, maybe I think up to 7 or 8, they're dressed as girls. And their heads are shaved, probably because of head lice, but there's a strand of hair that hangs down that's allowed to grow until they reach a certain age, and then there's a ceremony, and that lock of hair is cut off, and from then on they are dressed as boys. They are very suspicious people, this group, and they are afraid of juja-majujas, which are evil spirits, and so that's why they do it. I was standing looking at the women. They hadn't really noticed me, but right here she turns and looks, and she notices that Ralph has a camera behind my shoulder and is hiding behind me taking these pictures. So we quickly turn and walk away, and we didn't want to embarrass her any more than we already had. In contrast to these women, you can see the girl in the miniskirt. Under the king's rule, when we were there, only the older people or people from villages wore chaudhry, and this was not an unusual sight.
We're going to talk a little bit about Cottage Industries. In this case, this is a hat seller who has set up shop on one of the side streets near the downtown. Those little hats are the centerpiece for the turbans, which are wound around those. So he's having a bit of tea and waiting for people to come by to buy his wares. In this case, this is a pottery, right out where people could see what was going on, and the potter has one of his good friends there keeping him company. This is a flute seller, not very visible, but there on the side of the picture is David, who is about to buy a flute, and the flute seller is quite happy about the prospect of having a sale. This is a glass blower. Primitive by our standards, but very successful and very functional. And these boys are in a shop that makes chairs. They've got these saplings for framework, and they're weaving the bottom, they'll weave the back. You would think they should be in school, but they're probably there because their family needs them to earn a living. The boy on the right is wearing what looks like pajamas from the US, and that's probably exactly what they are. Straight from the Nixon Bazaar.
This is a little guy who really touched our heart. He's sitting on the rugs where his dad would sit during lunchtime, and in front of him is there were logs there, and they were making kebabs, meat on a stick. And dinner time is over, and he is just sitting there, and so we said salam alaikum, and he put his hand over his heart, which is a sign of respect, and grinned and said salam alaikum back to us, but he was just adorable. There were not many beggars because Muslims believe in giving alms to the poor, and but we did find some. This was one who was just sitting. It wasn't all that cold a day. This is a little waif that we took a picture of. She looks quite needy. And these children are very needy. The kids were dressed in snow jackets and had gloves, and she's sitting by the side of the road with her little sister who has something that she's chewing on.
This is a political rally. The government would not allow political rallies in the country anywhere except on the university campus. That was so the secret police could kind of keep track of what was going on. And so these are Marxist students, as it happens, and the university had been told that they would be there the next day with the various rallies of the various types of agitation. And so the university had closed, but I had some work to do, so I was at the university in the Faculty of Engineering doing some things, and I heard this ruckus and stepped out into the hall. There was just one hall in the faculty, and this group came charging through the doors, and they were waving their signs and saying, "Death to the Americans, down with the CIA, death to the Americans." Some of my students were in the group, and as they went by, they said, "Death to the Americans. Good morning, Professor Jackson. Down with the CIA," and they went on with their march. So I'm not sure they really had the full impact of what they were trying to do. These are some of my students. That was our fifth-year class, and Farhadi, one of the Afghan teachers there in the middle, their task had been to test form follows function by designing kites and then proving that they would actually fly.
These are my students. This was under the king. You can see that there were men and women in the same class. The girls are wearing slacks, one wearing a skirt above her knees. None of them had chaudhry on or head coverings. These students had all graduated and were going to be English teachers in schools. There were so many of them who had graduated because they were allowing women into classes, that there were no jobs for them in Afghanistan as teachers, and they could not leave Kabul and go out into the provinces and teach because they were women and had to live at home. So there was a program in Peace Corps. We don't go in and tell people what program they need. The government of the country has to come to Peace Corps and say, we need volunteers to do this, this, and this. So the Afghan government asked that volunteers be sent to teach secretarial skills to these students so that they could work in offices, and there were many English-speaking offices that were being developed in Afghanistan. And my job was to improve their English. It was an interesting experience. One of them was that I started talking about the Second World War, and they had never heard of it. This is my dear next-door neighbor, Nazifa. Her father was a provincial governor, and some years before had been assassinated. And she and her mother, and she had some siblings, lived next door to us. She came over one day very shyly and asked me if I would work with her in English. And of course, yes, we became really, really good friends. And she now is married to a man who was educated in Russia, and they live in California, and she has grandchildren, and we're still correspond.
She's representative of maybe 1% of the population who were really wealthy.
Okay, and this is our Dave. And just as our youngest Dave was joyfully running into the sunlight, Afghanistan, when we left in May of 1973, was joyfully racing into freedom, progress, prosperity, and peace. So this concludes our slides showing a bit of what we experienced in Afghanistan. In the major cities, particularly Kabul, things have changed considerably. There are more high-rise buildings. Whether they have a central sewer system or not, I'm not sure. But many more people, tall buildings, better medical care and schools. But life in the country remains pretty much the same as it was when we were there. So next, Ralph is going to, maybe if you want to take a quick stretch, is going to talk about what transpired in Afghanistan since shortly after we left.
I'm going to invest about 10 minutes of your time for this, and I think it's important that you kind of have a feeling for the progression of events in Afghanistan over the last 50 years. I'm going to go back a little ways and start with 1933, when Mohammad Zahir Shah was proclaimed king at the age of 19 after his father was assassinated. 31 years later, in 1964, a new, more democratic constitution, including a legislative body, was ratified. Zahir Shah was still king between 1971 and 1973 while our family was in Afghanistan, and there's a picture of him out in the lobby if you're interested to see what a king might have looked like. At the time, the country was beginning to move from an almost medieval to a more modern society, as you saw in some of the slides. As we used to say, it was madly rushing into the 16th century. We left in May, and 2 months later, in July, Zahir Shah was deposed by his cousin, Daoud, who was the prime minister. The king was in Italy for medical treatment at the time, and he went into exile. Initially, Daoud tried to implement some social and economic reforms, but his efforts were resisted by the conservative Islamic clerics. Also in the period between 1973 and 1973 and 1978, there was increasing Marxist influences as Soviet-trained Afghans infiltrated into the government and into the military. Daoud Khan was assassinated in a Marxist-led military coup in April of 1978. Nur Muhammad Taraki, a Soviet puppet, was installed as president. However, there was strong opposition by Islamic factions, and a year and a half later, in September of 1979, Taraki was murdered. That allowed the more moderate Prime Minister, Mohammad Amin, to take control of the government. However, that concerned the Soviets, who had seen Taraki as their opportunity to absorb Afghanistan into their sphere of influence. Meanwhile, on November 4th, and this is really important, 2 months after Taraki's murder, to the east in Tehran, the American embassy was attacked and taken over by Islamic students. The resulting hostage situation took the eyes of America and the West off of Afghanistan. The Soviets, seeing their opportunity, took advantage of the West's temporary distraction and invaded Afghanistan on December 24, 1979, 6 weeks later. They killed Mohammad Amin and installed Babrak Karmal as their new puppet ruler in Afghanistan. However, the majority of the Afghan people rejected what they considered godless communist rule, and from 1980 until 1989, the Mujahideen, freedom fighters, many from Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and other Islamic states, as well as Afghans, took to the mountains to resist. This was in reality a part of the Cold War between the communist states and the free world, and the U.S. surreptitiously supplied advisors, military supplies, and money quietly through Pakistan to the Mujahideen. The war created 6 million Afghan refugees who fled to Pakistan, Iran, and the West. 6 million. Here in Madison, a group of volunteers with previous experiences in Afghanistan formed the Afghan Relief Committee. We made money by selling chicken kebabs on the square and through donations. We settled 27 Afghan refugees from 2 extended families in rented apartments. So we have done this before. With the help of Stinger missiles, which the U.S. provided to shoot down Soviet helicopters, the Mujahideen eventually prevailed against the Soviets, and the last of the Soviet troops left Afghanistan in February of 1989. The Afghan puppet government troops continued to fight until the Mujahideen finally took Kabul in 1992. During the Soviet occupation, ethnic tribal groups led by warlords assembled militia fighters to defend their regions. The collapse of the central puppet government created a void, and the warlords began fighting each other for dominance, leading to a vicious civil war during the 1980s. Becoming alarmed by the increasing number of Afghan civilian casualties, the U.S. government, in spite of the warnings by educated Afghans around the world, decided to support a new group called the Taliban, after the Arabic name Talib, meaning student. The U.S. hoped that the Taliban, which had formed in militant Islamic religious schools in Pakistan, would be able to restore order in Afghanistan. In 1994, the Taliban fighters began to push into Afghanistan, bringing with them a very conservative, male-dominated, repressive version of Islamic government as they advanced. Human images, TV, and movies were banned. Even minor infractions of their rules were brutally punished. Girls were not allowed to go to school, and women were not permitted to leave their homes unless they had a male relative as a chaperone. By September 2001, most of Afghanistan, including Kabul, was under Taliban control. The exception was an area in the north under the leadership of the Northern Alliance, whose warlord was a man named Ahmad Shah Massoud, the Lion of the Panjshir. He was assassinated by an al-Qaeda suicide squad posing as reporters on September 9th, 2001. 2 days later, on 9/11, al-Qaeda carried out their attacks on the United States. The terrorists had been trained by Osama bin Laden, a Saudi national, in camps in Afghanistan. None of those terrorists turned out to be Afghans. However, on September 20th, President Bush demanded that the Taliban turn over any al-Qaeda members who were still in Afghanistan for prosecution. The Taliban leaders refused. So on October 7th, the U.S. began bombing preceding our invasion, which we did with our UN allies. The Taliban was quickly defeated, with remnants retreated into Pakistan and regrouping in the Pashtun tribal areas along the border. The next year, 2002, Hamid Karzai, a member of Zahir Shah's royal family, was installed as head of the UN-sanctioned interim Afghan government. Peace returned to Afghanistan for the first time in many years. The future looked bright. That was in 2002. However, on March 20th, 2003, the world once again took its eyes off of Afghanistan when the U.S. invaded Iraq looking for weapons of mass destruction, and the long-term consequences for the Afghans were terrible. In the short term, in October 2004, thanks, Carol, the Afghan population confirmed Hamid Karzai as their leader by electing him to be their president in the first ever national election. In 2009, Ashraf Ghani succeeded Karzai as president after a very highly contested national election which had no clear winner. However, starting in 2001, when the interim government was formed, the central Afghan government was weak and corrupt, no matter who was at its head. Accordingly, the population lost all respect or allegiance they might have had for their government. The government, without the support of most of its people, was unable to resist the relentless return of the Taliban in spite of the massive infusion of troops, supplies, funds, and other aid from the West. In mid-August 2021, as leaders of the central government, including President Ghani, fled and the Afghan National Army collapsed, the U.S. and its UN allies were forced out of Afghanistan. Shortly thereafter, as you know, the Taliban reestablished their ultra-conservative, brutal control over the entire country. I've just got a few words in conclusion. This evening, I will not try to get into the complex politics of what went wrong or who is to blame for the ease with which the Taliban reestablished control over Afghanistan. I will say that I believe it would be wrong to put too much of the blame on the members of the Afghan National Army, which the U.S. trained and supplied over many years. From what I understand, once it was publicly announced that the U.S. and the UN would withdraw their remaining troops, Ashraf Ghani's government stopped paying their army or giving them any bullets or other supplies. So as we withdrew, the Afghan soldiers had no way to continue fighting, and those who were not killed simply melted away and returned to try to protect their families. The situation in Afghanistan is dire. Not only are the country's people, especially the women, once again under the domination of a very repressive group who practice an ultra-conservative distortion of Islam. There is widespread destruction of basic infrastructure due to the years of fighting. The fighting has not ended because the Taliban is being challenged by even more radical Al-Qaeda and ISIS groups. There is widespread drought, reducing the internal supply of food. The banks are without funds, so that even those families who had money can not get to it, and there is very little opportunity for outsiders to get money into the country. As a result, massive starvation is a very real specter, and there is very limited access, even by international relief agencies. Our hearts are broken. Last page. The only good news is that well over 120,000 Afghans were able to escape during those last few traumatic days in August. They were processed in places like Doha and Qatar, and then sent to distribution locations in Europe and the US. At last count, 13,800 of them made their way to Wisconsin at Fort McCoy, where Carol Phelps of this congregation has been running the education programs. Our thanks and blessings go out to Carol, and we hope that she will be able to brief all of us on her experience at a later date. Here in Madison, Jewish Social Services and Open Doors for Refugees have already settled several Afghan families and expect to receive more soon. We have been in contact with both groups, and although it is difficult to find suitable housing at reasonable prices, they seem to have enough furniture and other supplies for now. Middleton Community Church raised $1,000 from contributions recently, which we sent on to Open Doors. So what else can we do? individually and as a congregation, we can welcome the Afghans with the same sincerity and warmth with which they received us 50 years ago. We hope that our presentation this evening has given each of you the understanding that they are people like us with the same hopes and dreams that we all share, and they are worth supporting in every possible way as they settle into our community. There may be opportunities to meet with individuals, to help with English instruction, to provide transportation, or otherwise to give of our time. There might be an opportunity for this congregation to adopt an Afghan family. There will always be a need for funds for Jewish social services and open doors, and we may want to have a specific fund drive for us to do so. We just learned yesterday that an international relief organization we've supported for many years, International Rescue Committee, actually still has personnel intact and working within Afghanistan. We just sent them a check, so that's another possibility. That concludes our presentation this evening. Thank you for coming, and we would love to see any questions or comments, and a little later we'll meet with you out in the lobby.